Hello, and welcome back to Media Reporter. My name is Clifford A. Marin, and tonight my guest is New York Law School professor David Epstein, an expert in contract law. Tonight, we will be discussing some of the misconceptions and generalities that the common man has toward contract law. Now, I am a law student, and Professor Epstein is a law professor, as I just mentioned. So we're going to be talking about what the everyday man should know about contract law. Now, Professor, thank you for being with us, first of all.
Good to be here.
Let's get right off the bat here. In terms of contract law and misconceptions that people have, you always hear the difference of, or not the non-difference of people saying, well, my word is as good as whatever I wrote down on this piece of paper. So, A, is that a big misconception? And B, if it is, what is the big difference between an oral contract and a written contract?
Well, surprisingly, it's not quite the kind of misconception that you might think it would be. If anything, it's probably a more common misconception to think that if something isn't written down, that it can't be a contract, that you can't agree to do something orally and actually be bound contractually. With some rare exceptions here and there, you can. There's really very little in the way of law that says that you cannot enter into an oral agreement. It's something that in some small way we do every time we buy something. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, because every now and again people get into trouble over something like that, particularly if we're dealing with like small business people. They don't understand that if they've agreed to do something, even though it's not in writing, it still may be binding. There still may be a contract. There still may be problems if they don't do what it is that they had agreed to do. On the other hand, it's usually a better idea to have the contract in writing. When it's in writing, there's not going to be any debate about what the people agree. Well, there can be some debate. But in general, if things have been done properly, you can tell exactly what it is that both sides have agreed to. So, particularly if you are dealing with anything that's of any importance at all, you don't want to have it, you don't want just an oral or verbal contract, you do want the thing in writing.
Now, this might be too general of a question, but is there a certain threshold that within the law, I guess, of your recommendation or of your of overall thought of what should be written versus what should not be written, or when it's okay to not write something?
It's a hard line to draw. There are some things where it's fairly obvious. You just go in. I want to buy this thing. Won't be in for 2 weeks. Okay, you'll order it. It'll be here in 2 weeks, and then I'll come in and pick it up. I mean, you don't want to have a written contract every time you've got something like that. Right. You get to a level, particularly where you're talking about performance that's going to happen over a period of time, where you want to make it. You want to be clear what everyone is going to be doing. If you're buying something that's fairly large, like a car, a house, the contract should be in writing. There should not be anything that's open to debate. If you've got businesses entering into some agreements between themselves to supply things or provide services, it's probably a good idea to have things in writing.
Now, once we have that contract, whether it's in writing or orally made, if a verbal amendment is made to that, what type of legal binding is there to that? Or is it a better idea to have a written amendment?
It's always better to have a written, simply because if you've bothered to have everything reduced to writing in the first place, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to allow either parts of the contract or changes in the contract to be oral, because it undoes everything you had in mind when you decided that this should be written. When you can have something oral, when you also have a written contract, and when you don't, can get complicated. Basically, regardless, when you've got a written contract, the one thing that's not going to happen is you're not going to have a verbal agreement that can contradict that contract. So if The perfect example would be, you're buying a car, and contract says that the warranty is good for 3 years. The sales guy tells you that it's going to be warranted for 5 years. Well, what he's saying is oral, and it's contradicting what was in the written contract. So that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are additional promises. So instead, let's say instead of the car guy saying that we'll fix this car for 5 years, he tells you that you can have free car washes for the rest of your life. Presumably there's nothing in the contract that says anything about car washes, so that you could argue that this is just this extra thing. And as long as it, for the most part, doesn't contradict what was going on, it could happen. Mm-hmm. That's why we like to use what's called a merger clause. Mm-hmm. Now, what a merger clause says is that here's the whole deal, folks. This is the entire writing. This writing is the entire agreement between the parties. And sometimes they get a little fancier, supersedes prior or contemporaneous agreements. But you put something specific in the contract that says this is the whole thing.
Right. And then if you want to add something else, then you have to write an entirely new contract for that.
Well, what you would do is you could have an amendments clause, mm-hmm. which would require all amendments to be in writing, signed by the parties. Sometimes the merger clause, actually, for the most part, the merger clause would probably even be enough for that, because mm-hmm. it's saying here's the whole thing. And obviously, if you've got an oral change, that means it's not the whole thing. It's contradicting what's there. That helps protect against someone claiming that this completely separate extra thing that does not contradict what was in the written contract also took place. Mm-hmm. So a merger clause is something that should almost always be there. And if you are reading through a contract that someone's asked you to agree to, you don't have a lawyer looking at it instead of you, it's something to look for.
Right.
Particularly if promises, if you're a customer, the odds are that the promises were made to you. And you should be aware that, while it may be hard to prove the promises, in any event, if you've got something like that in your writing, no court's going to allow anyone to even talk about these oral promises.
Right. And going with the idea of promises, I could say something to you, or you could say something to me. But what I said is not necessarily what I meant, and vice versa. Right. Now, when Nixon was in the White House, he used to use the term, I know what I said, and I know what I meant. But that seems to be ambiguous, and there's a big ambiguity there. So what is really the biggest point in terms of intent and what had been written or what had been said in terms of contract law?
Well,